Welcome, busy gamers. Today we're going to be talking about HiFi Rush. What's good, what's bad, and that all important question, is it worth your time? If you've joined me for another worth your time video in the past, feel free to go ahead and skip to the section you're most interested in, and if not, let's head right into the overview. HiFi Rush was developed by Tango Gameworks, who have now put down the dark and dreary to deliver something a little more in line with their company's name. In HiFi Rush, the rhythm, the beat, the music, they're everything. So you'll take the role of Chai, a kid who unfortunately is barely more intelligent than the tea he's named after, as he takes the role of a wannabe rocker and makes up for what he lacks with heart, with tenacity, and a little bit of rhythm. As the story unfolds, he goes to get his handicapped arm repaired or replaced and leaves with a new metallic model and an iPad for a heart. iPod. See, I've modernized so much, even I might be judging him for that. From here on out, the company that gave it to him tries to recycle him due to the defective procedure, but he now sees and forces his own rhythm onto the world around him. This has a lot of implications, but suffice it to say that everything from this point on in the game happens to the beat. How you walk, how you jump, and even how you fight. Initially, Chai doesn't think of much other than his own escape from the company. And honestly, who could blame him? But as he makes that attempt to escape and often struggles, he befriends a lovable cast of characters. Each of them have their own reasons for fighting against Mandalay Industries, which is the company who made Chai, and they eventually convince him that helping them take down the company is the right idea. As a trade for his services, they're going to help him escape. Throughout the rest of the game, you move towards those goals by solving puzzles, platforming your way through a colorful and cartoonish environment, and fighting each of the Vandalay industry leaders, sending hundreds and hundreds of robots to the scrap pile. You'll be taking them down kicking and screaming while they do all they can to protect their jobs and the corporate bottom line. So at the time of this review, I've played HiFi Rush for about 14 hours. I've reached the end of track 9, which is kind of a level for this particular game, and I have taken down Mimosa, who is the boss of that particular track. What is good about HiFi Rush? The music in HiFi Rush is truly excellent, and that's what I want to call out first. Because it's a rhythm game, a music game, of course the music has to be front and center. If you're a fan of alternative rock, you'll be a fan of the soundtrack, as it has a pretty good mix of licensed music and several tracks that were made exclusively for the game. It even boasts tracks that are recognizable with artists such as Nine Inch Nails and the Black Keys. Again, with a game in which music takes the focal point, it's make or break, and HiFi Rush delivers. Even the game's streamer-friendly soundtrack, which I have to use for the background of a lot of these videos, has a much better composition than that of your average game. All in all, I consistently found myself tapping my foot to the beat or bobbing my head in time with the music. This is something a game rarely brings out in my personality, even one that focuses on music. Let's move on to talk about the combat. That's the next biggest thing for this particular game. Combat in HiFi Rush is simple at its core, and contrary to what I see many people say, most of the combat encounters in this particular game can be completed and passed through by just swinging away wildly or kind of tapping on your buttons, mashing wildly as you lose the beat in a panicked moment. You don't have to have rhythm to win. That being said, there's a lot of layers to peel back for those that want to, and hitting in those beats are very satisfying. As I mentioned earlier, you and your enemies do move to the beat and they attack to the beat. So on the player's end, regardless of when you press your buttons, your strikes, your swings, they're going to be occurring and landing on the beat. And the more accurately you time your button presses with the rhythm, the more damage you're going to do per swing. On the enemy front, you know their attacks are going to be hitting on the beat, so the timing of your blocks, your dodges become a rhythm of its own. There's also a very large amount of combo attacks to be acquired and updated throughout your journey, each of which, while often somewhat difficult to pull off in the chaotic combat, have rewarding events such as lifting your enemies up or juggling them into the air. Don't worry if you're rhythmically challenged. It does have a lot of ways for you to identify these rhythms. You have a cat that follows you around. It floats. It pulses in the beat. The entire area has many different environmental effects that will pulse on the beat. And you can also bring up a meter at the bottom of the screen that, again, will pulse and will have lines as the beat hits. So it's not something you have to just identify yourself, and you do get some tactile feedback when you succeed. Third thing I want to call out for positives here is the comedy of the game. And this one might be a bit divisive. When I first started playing the game, I wasn't really sure that the comedy would be for me. It's a silly kid who wants to be a rocker, and as he is harassing the robot that checks him in, I'm like, oh, I'm going to be annoyed by this kid. Like, he just wouldn't work for me. He's named after tea, and it's just not the setup I thought would have me laughing. But moment after moment, it caused me to laugh out loud. From the first moment, you're kind of ejected off the operating table into a chain link fence, leaving a full impression of your body, to the concerning, and I mean concerning here, issue of why Peppermint's fully controlled robotic cat just constantly sits there and licks itself. It's a relaxed and quirky personality that really comes through. I'll note that when it misses, it really does miss on comedy, though. And for me, the vending machine that seems to stalk you throughout the game, giving you tutorials, and continues to call you their friend or soulmate or whatever, it was a major miss for me, and I actually found him to be terrifying and creepy. So, with that note, what's bad about HiFi Rush? For me, the ever-present combat scoring gauge was a large detractor for this particular game. It pulled me out of my fun, and even when I felt like a combat or sequence was going well, I would find myself just glancing over at it. And I would get disheartened if I was at or below a B or something of that nature. This is just my competitive nature coming out. I often feel that if I'm going to be doing something, I just want to do it well, and maybe it won't turn off many players. That being said, I really wish it was an optional feature that allows you to have the score constantly displayed if you're pushing a high score or you're trying to leaderboard, but I wish it was set as invisible by default. While I found myself constantly looking forward to the next battle in this particular game, I did personally find the levels themselves to be fairly forgettable. It's not that they were inherently bad, but the platforming sections for me all run together, and they primarily have levels that consist of running around and gathering up gears with the occasional short subsection of timed jumps or rhythm-based door locks and things of that nature. It was a good excuse to listen to each level's songs, but even the additional mechanics like summoning Pepper and grappling around really felt forced outside of a combat scenario. It was very apparent how they would be used, and I didn't really feel like I had to engage much with that. So I've talked about combat several times, and it remains my favorite aspect of this particular game, but there are some late game combat sequences that devolve in one of two specific ways for me. The first way is the complete chaos that can occur when you're overwhelmed by enemies. It does take away from the blocking, dodging, or attacking rhythm, and it limits you to a lot of defensive and opportunistic play. Now that's fine, but after unlocking so many interesting attacks and combinations, it does kind of feel lackluster to have them relegated to rare opportunities, or at least for me. Now, the second issue is that many cases in the late game combat becomes its own minigame that's not actually combat at all, but it's more akin to the early game tutorials in which you were to learn a pattern of on, off, hitting on the rhythm, before then tapping your keys to the beat. Many of the bosses would actually have pretty large sections where your only option was to learn the attacks or the blocks and then pass that rhythm challenge. You then get to move forward in fighting, but you don't really get to use the style or the skills that you learned previously. You're just completing a challenge based on the rhythm itself. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on to the ephemeral efficiencies. Now, this particular style of game doesn't lend itself to a lot of efficient play, but this particular game, I think, does it about as well as you possibly could for a game like this. There are checkpoints literally everywhere. While you can't necessarily save and quit on a middle platform of a jumping puzzle, You can save right before that jumping puzzle, and right after that puzzle, there are checkpoints on both sides. And the levels themselves are kind of broken up into sub-levels. So there are tracks, but each of them kind of has a combat encounter or something at the end of it as well. So if you get on and you're wanting to knock out some form of section, you can do that relatively quickly. It feels pretty good. And they do have overall relatively short levels. Now, it is a somewhat short game as start to finish, and that kind of makes sense based on the overall story and the style of play. It does not overstay its welcome, and it's pretty accessible. It's also very replayable because the big moments are those in-game boss battles. The big moments are those robot bot fights where you're just making scrap everywhere. And so it does encourage you to replay those and to try to do leaderboards and things of that nature. I think it does a really good job there. So let's go on to the final scores. I've been pretty positive about this game, and I struggled a little bit, but I went ahead and gave this an overall score of a 7. It could be higher. The game has heart, soul, and it strikes a chord in just the right way for me. While its humor may be a little too silly or off for some, if it works for you, it's going to serve to constantly keep the game light, happy, and fun as you rock out to the beat and do your absolute best to avoid thinking about just how poor your sense of rhythm really is. And in all honesty, the things that keep it from going up higher are its focus on how visible and punitive those scores are, as well as how forgettable its platforming stage is. The Ephemeral Efficiency score for this particular one is going to be a 9. For this type of game, I think it does a phenomenal job, and there's really nothing I could ask for it to do better as far as efficiency goes, as far as respect for your time goes, and it remains the right balance of overall length in game as well. I felt like I got a good amount of gameplay out of it, and I'm technically not even finished with the game. Okay, that brings me to the end of my review for HiFi Rush. I really hope you enjoyed this video and that you got something out of it. If you liked it, please go ahead and leave me a comment with some feedback or a like or a subscribe. I really appreciate that. That keeps me wanting to continue to do this going forward. I really enjoy engaging with you all, the community, and I hope you have a wonderful time gaming until the next video.